Hello, welcome to another Museum FAQ video. Hi there, Ed. And I'm Paul Orselli, President and Chief Instigator at POW, Paul Orselli Workshop on Long Island. And I'm delighted to be joined this afternoon, at least afternoon where we are when we are recording this, by Ed Rodley. Hi, Ed. Thanks for taking the time today.
Hi, Paul. Good to be here. Glad to join your esteemed company of people who've been having conversations with you.
And now you've made it more esteemed. So I always like to start out by having people tell us a little bit about their background, because as you well know, usually it's not a straight line. There are interesting diversions. So I think it's useful for people to hear about that. And then we'll launch into the main conversation. So take it away.
Background. Let's see. When I was little, I was going to be either an archaeologist or an astronaut. I have done neither, though I have worked with both in the course of my career. I have worked in museums literally since I was a kid. I was an extremely junior volunteer at like age 11. Had, every crappy front of house job you could ask for in a large museum. Have spent the bulk of my professional career working in science and art museums, mainly in exhibition development, but I started off as a registrar, I drove the forklift, you name it, I've done a little bit of it. And over the last probably 15, 20 years, I've been extremely interested in the intersection of new digital technologies and museum experiences. And, those things have evolved over the years from like the internet, hey, it's going to be big, to, social media, it's going to change everything. And so here I am today.
Awesome. Well, I always think, when you think of the prototypical museum job description, there's always that part, and other duties as required. So driving a forklift or working with astronauts or archaeologists, that's all part of the gig. Well, I thought we would start off the conversation today. Of course, we're recording this in the midst of what some might describe as a perfect storm, worldwide pandemic, economic situation, social justice concerns, and a looming election in the United States coming up. But why not throw something else into the mix? But I was really interested. I'm a fan of your blog, Thinking About Museums, and your Twitter account. You are, I would say it's fair to say, a good active part of the museum Twitterati. So that's good. And I know, as of when we're recording, I was saying before we started that you have a message pinned up on your, at the top of your Twitter account, along the lines of, okay, where do we go now? But in the spirit, from what I read and the article you referenced in your write-up, in the spirit of moving forward lightly, I think is a nice way to phrase it, and but also leaving behind the dead bodies and the corpses and the heavy baggage that maybe don't have any place anymore in our perhaps both personal and professional lives, but as it relates to museums. So with that perambulating preamble, I'm wondering where do you think we should be going? Now, that's such a simple question to answer, but I'll still throw it to start the conversation.
Sure. So back in January of 2020, I can remember thinking to myself, I am so glad 2019 is over. What a terrible year. God, 2020, just, there's no way we could possibly top that in terms of just all the crap that went on. In terms of the world at large, the museum sector in particular, my own professional and personal life is like, whew, all right, 2020, let's go. And of course, 2020 has turned out the way that 2020 is busy turning out. One of the things that I found most consistently troubling about 2020 as it continues to slowly, painfully unravel is the extent to which the museum sector has really failed to take advantage of all of the possibilities that the pandemic has offered. I remember when everybody started going into lockdown in this country in March, I was certain that you were going to see this clear bifurcation in the field between the places that were going to see this as an opportunity. You know, when was the last time anybody's museum was closed for 2 weeks solid? No visitors, nothing to worry about in terms of the day-to-day. Tends to fill up so much of our time. There'd be those folks who'd be like, what can we do differently now? And then there would be the people who'd be like, how soon can we get back to February? And I've just never ceased to be disappointed at how the field just seems to have opted almost entirely for the, how quickly can we get back to February, pre-pandemic times, without any nod even to all of the things that 2020 has laid bare in terms of the way the museum sector operates. Forget about just terrible business models. I mean, you've got white supremacy, all of the systemic injustices that are embedded in the current system, persistent, nagging workplace issues about equity and fairness. Somebody who's worked in museums his whole adult life, the idea that you'd be seeing a sudden major unionization push in museums of any place is just, if you told me that a year ago, I would have just never stopped laughing at you. And yet here we are. Things have gotten so bad that people all over the country are saying like, yeah, you know what?
Unions always start for the right reasons,
right.
is what I'll say.
Well, I would say they start for the right reasons, and it has to be really bad for them to gain traction. And
that's right.
Boy, have they been gaining traction.
Yeah.
So rather than succumb to the despair of like, everything is bleak, I fell back on a couple of pieces of writing that have been very influential and really very helpful to me over the last year. The one that was sort of the prime driver of that was this piece, "The Pandemic is a Portal." It was written by an Indian author named Arundhati Roy. And her whole conceit of the piece, which is brilliant, if you haven't read it, you should totally go read it, is that these kinds of supremely traumatic events can be portals. They can be a great excuse to leave behind stuff. So you were joking about like not dragging carcasses around with us, which is one of the things she asks in the piece. Like, you can decide to try to go back to the way things were with all the problems and all of the baggage, or you can decide to use this opportunity to step through into the post-pandemic world differently. And what would that different look like? And that was sort of the thing that I was musing on at the end of the piece. Like, what would it look like if we were to say like, okay, if we were going to start over again, or start afresh, or start something different even, what would those institutions look like? Who would work there? Who would they operate for? How would they operate? Like, all of those things I find throughout my whole career have been things I've been interested in. But now, here is a window that you can see closing, right? At some point, most of the world, if not the United States, is going to get the pandemic under control, and there will be a post-pandemic reality. And will museums in 2021 look just like museums in 2019? Probably a lot of them
I
will.
hope not.
Well, a lot of them will close. They will not survive, right? Because the business model is terrible. The ones that do survive, the really, really big ones, they will go back to being what they have always been, which is largely, I would argue, tourist attractions. If you can survive solely on single-time visits like the Met and the Louvre and the British Museum, different rules apply to you. For the rest of the field that needs to be much more worried about mission and relevance, what is that going to mean in a post-pandemic world? I don't know if you saw today, Nina Simon posted an interesting piece on Medium about like, what are the kind of qualities you're going to need in the next generation of leaders? And I think that is a really that's probably the pressing issue, I would say, at this point.
Sure.
The kind of change that's going to be necessary to figure out like what the next generation of museums is going to look like is going to need people to actually be leading that. And
Yeah, the next generation of leaders for the next iteration of museums.
Yeah, and they're going to need to look different and act different and have different skills and strengths. And it's not just going to be about being a white guy of a certain age who looks good in a suit and can talk to wealthy donors, which, you know, I choose to find extremely encouraging.
Yeah, well, as somebody who doesn't look good in a suit, that doesn't relate to me. So, so two things. One is just a housekeeping thing. Since you've mentioned several pieces that I think people will like to refer to, as they say in YouTube land, we will put the links in the description below to your piece and Roy's piece and Nina Simon's piece and other things that come up during our conversation. But I wanted to go back one step to what you were saying and the idea of sort of this missed opportunity that museums are always sort of on this treadmill, rushing headlong from one project or interweaved between projects to the next and never having a chance to push the pause button. Well, here we are. You know, the entire world has essentially pushed a pause button. We haven't pushed it, but it's been pushed for us. So I'm just wondering why, as each of us have worked our entire adult lives in the museum business. There's a scary thought, but why you think we haven't taken advantage, the museum business hasn't taken advantage of this pause button that's been pushed for us. You know, we seem to want that, we seem to wish for that and ask that, and then when it's thrust upon us, when we could actually have some time to ponder the next moves and to think about things, and I don't say this lightly, you know, people have been furloughed, people have lost their jobs. There are all kinds of situations. I'm not, and I don't mean that in a light way at all. But that is in a perverse way an opportunity. As someone who's lost jobs, you know, if you don't have to rush headlong immediately into the next thing, if that circumstances allow or circumstances are forced upon you, you do have that opportunity to pause, to ponder, well, what do I want my next move to be personally? What do I want the organization that I'm involved with? Where should we be going? Like, so I'm just too late to make the question short, but basically, why haven't museums really taken advantage of what could be legitimately viewed as an opportunity? Museums, museum workers, board members, the whole mechanism for taking advantage of the pause button.
There's probably a 4-hour-long answer in there, but I will try to boil it down to a couple of smaller points. Speaking exclusively in a US context, I would say the precarity of the economics of most museums is probably number one. You know, that coupled with a real just lack of vision in terms of the vast majority of the people leading American museums. You know, the model is the model, and you know, if the model has stopped working because of the pandemic, and they're just going to try to get the model to work again. It reminds me of
get a bigger hammer. Get a bigger hammer.
Well, you know, like when you're playing with a dog and you hide the ball and you pretend to throw the ball, and the dog goes running after it, even though you've still got the ball in your hand. And the dog comes running back, and you show it the ball again, and you pretend to throw it, and the dog goes and runs off. That lack of saying, okay, we've tried this and it's not working, maybe we need to try something different, as opposed to like, we need to just double down and try the same thing harder. and faster and cheaper with fewer people and less time, I would say are probably the two big things. So really, I would say for me, probably the precarity is the number one thing, right? It's how can you possibly dream about doing things differently if your primary worry is, you know, you've got like 2 weeks worth of payroll in the bank before you have to start firing people. Like people in that position, I can totally understand not wanting to think differently about things because you have immediate pressing concerns, right? It's easy from a position of relative comfort to be able to look at other people scrambling in a crisis and say like, you're doing it wrong. So I think if anything, the way that the current model has been exposed as being really unsustainable, except for very, very few institutions, is probably the biggest thing that's going to come out of this. You know, I'm seriously afraid that a lot of institutions are going to close and never reopen, right? The sector is going to shed a lot of people who it's never going to hire back, or it's going to, you know, hire back a smaller number of them. And maybe in a year or 2 years, people will have enough space to be able to look back and say like, okay, what did we learn from this? And how do we need to change the way that we're going to do things? I think that's one path forward. I'd say the other path forward will be new institutions, right? People who aren't burdened with an existing organizational structure and a way of doing things and a mindset and a board that is probably not fit for the 21st century.
Okay, so that's now that we've stared deep into the pit of despair, we can shift towards some of maybe those two last points that you mentioned. You know, how, and also the point that you mentioned in your essay, which is maybe twofold. How can we move forward more lightly? Parse that however you want, and also how can new things, new organizations, new models, new approaches be forged, sort of completely shed, you know, like snake shedding its skin. So I just wonder if you can pivot your crystal ball in a somewhat more prescriptive and positive manner and think about those two things.
Okay. Yes, I'll try not to be too much of a gloomy Gus, which in 2020
no, I'm
kind of
fine.
hard.
I'm fine with that. And like we said at the beginning, we'll see where the conversation goes. Yep. But the thing is, I also don't want to. I don't think. Well, I'll speak for myself. I don't want to sort of add to the doom scrolling and staring into the pit of despair. There are certainly moments that we all have had for that during these times. But then at a certain point, you're like, okay, now what am I going to do to get out of this, or to start to get out of this pit, or to move away from this aspect of things?
This week, I am very interested in looking at the question of relevance. What is it about what museums do that is relevant to the vast majority of the people who make up the audience, people who go to museums? And how can you reframe or reposition that kind of institution, and maybe it's not even a museum, in such a way that it's not completely beholden on private philanthropy and boards full of people who are selected mainly for their alleged ability to give large sums of money to charity, and adopt some other kind of model that relies on more people giving less rather than a few people giving pretty much everything. Right, so when you look at places like, you know, the Met just announced the other day that like they're ending unpaid internships. But why are they ending unpaid internships?
Yeah, because somebody opened their wallet for millions of dollars.
$1 million. Yeah, exactly. So full marks for doing the right thing. I know they've been getting a bit of a beating in a museum Twitter for it not being a budgetary priority, but really all of their budgetary priorities come from rich people giving them bags of cash. So in that sense, it's just like every other decision they make. And they're doing the right thing. At the end of the day, who cares? As long as they're doing the right thing. But if that's your model, then you wind up spending a great deal of your time trying to find those people, trying to court those people, trying to frame whatever it is you think you'd like to do in ways that they might find interesting and appealing. And unless that's your audience, I suppose you could actually, make a museum exclusively for the 1%.
Some
I'll have to think about that one.
I mean, some might argue that's what some of the big museums are anyway, but leaving that snide aside.
They all have as their mission statements something different, and they all claim to be for broad audiences. And I just don't think that model is going to have much more legs going forward. The disconnect between like what museums say they do and how museums actually organize themselves to do it is just been laid so bare, basically. One of the things that I haven't seen commented on much in the US press is the extent to which American museums, and I'll pick on art museums because that was my last employer, was an art museum. And they're usually the worst in terms of being just egregious about things. Where their boards are entirely full of people who have been chosen for their ability to contribute. Like, I have really not heard many examples of private philanthropists stepping up to save institutions or save people's jobs.
I missed that whole part of the story when MoMA was laying off all their educators.
Yeah. MoMA, Tenement Museum, the list goes on and on and on and on. And if that's the primary reason for having boards comprised the way they are, then okay, that model ain't working too well because they don't seem to be stepping up. So I'm just wondering, is part of this,
I agree wholeheartedly, relevance and maybe legitimately focusing on the many instead of the few, meaning the few rich. That seems good. I'm just curious, as I've been thinking about this and the inequities that were already sort of baked into museums that have just, the veneers have been stripped away more obviously now. I'm just wondering how we get away, because if we talk about some of these big museums, it seems to an outsider who also is an insider, because I'm a museum person, it seems like their message is, we need to protect the building and the collections and basically screw these people, so I'm wondering what a new model or a new approach that was not so tied to both physical facilities and collections. I mean, I'm thinking, of course, children's museums and science centers originally, when they came out in their sort of proto-incarnations, were not considered museums because they didn't have collections, many of them, most of them. But yet they still seem to be among very popular museums, of course, and spread far and wide in different corners of the US and beyond. So I just throw that out there. I don't know if there's anything to hook into there about this notion of buildings and collections. Like, are those some of the dead bodies that we need to leave behind in a way related to this conversation?
I don't necessarily think buildings or collections need to go away. I agree with you that is either necessary to be the kind of thing that we would consider a small M museum or something like a museum? Obviously not. Although, of course, we also live in a time where even ICOM can't decide what a museum is or isn't successfully. So, you know, the time is right.
We saw how that worked out,
Right,
or how it
right.
is working out.
I think when I look at institutions that I know of that seem like they are going to come out of this better off than institutions that don't, the one thing, yeah, pretty much that they all have in common is that they have all actually figured out what it means to exist in a community. So for the ones with buildings, they are physically rooted in a community, like the building is at this location, surrounded by whatever they're surrounded by, and they have figured out ways to be useful to their local community in a way that is very different than the way that museums used to talk about mission statements in the before times, where, you know, audience was a very nebulous sort of thing. And nowadays, I think the places that have been able to say, like, okay, we know exactly who our audience is, it's y'all right around here, and, you know, we're going to have a food pantry starting here, and we're, you know, we're opening up the doors so you can come into the lobby when the police start shooting tear gas at you, and other ways of being really concretely useful in a way that they haven't traditionally been in the past, right? Museums have tended to be more sort of like, we're just going to be standing here on the sidelines.
So obviously we can include some examples in the in the description below, but I'm just wondering, just trying to end this on a more positive note. Sure. Since we called out a few bad actors, let's leave them aside, or places that we don't think are doing such a great job. What are a couple examples of those aforementioned museums that are being responsive to their community and positioning themselves for what comes next in a more positive way? Can you, like off the top of your head, you want to call out a couple of examples?
I would say, you know, the Oakland Museum, not surprisingly, has really, you know, they have spent years, literally years, trying to figure out what does it mean to serve Oakland, right? It's right in the name of the museum, the Oakland Museum. So they have it easier than some other places. My friend Hillary Spencer, who's the new director of the Children's Museum of the Upstate in South Carolina, you know, has been working really hard on figuring out what the community needs, whether or not it's an actual interactive children's museum, which is what it currently is, but like, how can you make the space available to the community in a way that is responsive to what the community needs? And like right now, they need space in which to have classes. Right? If they're going to do social distancing, then the schools aren't big enough to fit all of the kids. So where do those kids go? You know, lots of museums have lots of space. And if you open your brain up to the idea that they can contain more than just the exhibits that are currently in them, then there could be all kinds of needs. And, you know, the hard part is actually talking to the people in the community and listening to what the people in the community say back to you and then acting on it.
Well, and viewing your mission as an expansive mission, not as sort of a firewall between you and the community. So that's good. I think it has to be bigger than the typical collect, preserve exhibit. Like if that's all you're going to do, then sit out the pandemic and hope you survive. Those are two good examples. Any other come to mind right now, or if not, we can, like I say, put them in the description and we can.
I'll think of some others.
Okay.
Colonial Williamsburg, I remember early on being one of the first places out of the gate to really talk about their staff being an important resource and actually acting on it, you know, in a responsible way, like figuring out how to actually engage all of the people who work there with the reality of like, we're not going to make payroll unless we do something. What should we do? Instead of just saying like, okay, we decided we're getting rid of you guys, and you know, I'll also take a 5% pay cut just to prove that I'm a decent sort. You know, there are other places out there.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I mean, maybe sort of a marker of places and people to keep track of, like when the after comes, whatever that
Yeah.
means, whenever that means, is the people who and the organizations who really worked hard to protect their core. And by their core, I don't mean their collections and their buildings, but the people who work there. And then in the same way, protect and really be responsive to the communities that they serve and in their immediate area, the however that's viewed, the communities they serve. So yeah, I think the examples you gave, and like when I was thinking about that question, like the Oakland Museum came to mind, the Walters Art Museum, you know, I thought it was amazing when the director, when she spoke from the Walters Art Museum in Baltimore. And, you know, basically she said, to paraphrase, she's working hard, and I understand it. It's not like people just cavalierly fire people. I'm not saying that, but there are ways to humanely treat people and not. But anyway, she said, you know, if we're really part of the civic fabric, we can't add to the unemployment crisis in our community and our country. And I was like, well, that's a different sort of statement from a museum director, an art museum director. So I admired that she said that, and she, as far as I can tell, backed it up too. So that's great.
Yeah, that's the key.
Yeah,
actually
as always. Yeah. Well, we could have a whole other conversation about that too. Well, I really appreciate you taking the time, Ed. I
was happy to be asked.
No, of course, and again, I really want to have the focus to be on the people who I invite to have the conversations and give people a sense of what they're thinking about and to share ideas with the community. And in that spirit, I don't know if you have any last words or final thought that you might want to share before we do push the old record button to click off.
I'd love to leave you with one last provocation that I've been sort of sitting on for this whole conversation. When you were talking about like what would it be like to go forth lightly, and one thing I keep thinking about is the way that different kinds of institutions have managed to retain their core while broadening their mission. And I look at like public libraries as a primary example, right? What do libraries do? Well, they're supposed to just have books, and they know where the books are and they give you books. But you know, you go to any public library in the country today and look at the actual list of services they provide, and books is just one of them. Yet they are still libraries, being vital, essential parts of the community. And I would argue there are very few museums, at least in the US, possibly in the world, that are as relevant and necessary as public libraries. So what would a museum look like that acted more like a library in terms of the kinds of things it did and its sense of being a service organization, right? We exist to serve the people who come, however they come to us. That's one of the things that I'm sort of noodling on these days.
Well, I appreciate you sharing that noodle, that provocation. That's a perfect way to end here, because that leaves that idea in people's head to say, yeah, why couldn't I pick up my tax forms at my local museum? Or why couldn't I get help starting a business at my local museum, or what have you, you know? So that's a great way to end.
All right.
Thanks again. I appreciate you taking
Good to see you, Paul.
Good to see you as well.
Hopefully we'll see each other in the flesh sometime.
Yeah, one magic day, whenever
maybe
that
2021?
day is. Hey, don't start talking about how this year turned out.
Yeah. I think so.
Okay, thanks again.
Thanks for having me.